I was not operating under the presumption that if a black woman had been hired over me, that she must have been less experienced than me, which seemed to have been his presumption about me, right? So again, if we are being privileged by a certain situation, if we care about others, we need to be willing to sacrifice our own privilege in order to benefit others. Now, perhaps that means that I should quit my job, right? And maybe one day I will be strong enough to do that. Not that I would even be guaranteed that the job will go to someone who is more diverse than me, right? So there are lots of things there. But the idea is that we should be willing to support a system that helps others, even if it comes at the expense of our own privilege. Okay, so this leads us to Michael Kimmel. Masculinity is Homophobia, specifically fear, shame, and silence in the construction of gender identity. And I shared another PowerPoint with you in the media for this week that I really would like you to go look at. That includes a slide with, I'm blanking on his name, very famous, Mike Tyson, very famous boxer. And there's a quote from him as he is about to fight, one of his opponents. And what's interesting to note is not just the vulgarity of the language that Mike Tyson uses to try to demonstrate his dominance over him, but specifically how the language he uses is homophobic in the sense that he is actually describing engaging in sexual acts with this man, but in a way that implies that Mike Tyson in this sexual act would be the dominant individual, the dominant sexual partner, while the other man would be taking on the quote-unquote feminine part or role in that sex act. And so even though he's implying that he would be willing to engage in a homosexual act with this man, he's doing it in such a way that is very homophobic because it's putting down a feminized man and asserting to his mind, right, his traditional male dominance. So it's a really fascinating quote. I'm definitely not going to read it to you out loud. There's a lot of bad language in it, but I just think it's a really great example of what he's talking about, what Michael Kimmel is talking about in this paper, right? And so the basic idea here in his paper is that hegemonic masculinity, as we've described it, comes from a fear of men being ridiculed as quote-unquote too feminine, and that this fear is going to motivate a lot of behaviors on the part of men which will help to maintain and then perpetuate that exclusionary masculinity, right? This masculinity that excludes anyone who is not fitting that hegemonic model, right? So the claim here, of course, is that manhood is socially constructed, right? Because it's constantly being played out, acted upon, reasserted over time, and also redefined, right? So many of the reasons we've seen before to presume that manhood is socially constructed. And so because it's socially constructed, again, that means that it does not have to be rooted in insecurity, right? If something is constructed by society, we can work to change it. It doesn't happen overnight, but we can work to change that. And so we can change the fact that hegemonic masculinity has been rooted in this fear, right? It doesn't have to be rooted in competition, right? So being a man should not have to mean asserting your masculinity over somebody else. This reminds me of I've been watching MasterChef, and I was recently watching an episode where these two men were, arguing with each other in the kitchen, and they just couldn't, put past, they couldn't let this argument go until one of them asserted their dominance over the other. And they only stopped fighting when Gordon Ramsay came in and asserted his dominance over both of them, right? And that was like the only time they felt comfortable working together. And so this notion of constantly being in competition to assert that you're the bigger man, that you're the one in charge, right, does not have to be something that we use to define what it means to be a man or to be masculine, right? And certainly this implies that masculinity does not have to be seen as the opposite of everything that is too feminine or seen as not being macho. Again, just to share an example of this, I have a friend whose father is very traditional man, in the ways that we've been talking about. He was raised as a cowboy, right? So a macho sense of who he is, but he's been having a lot of back problems as he gets older. And so his daughter was recommending that he try yoga, right? So something that is seen as very feminine, even though it's not. And he was very resistant to the idea until this bodybuilder friend of theirs shared with him that he happened to do yoga. There was something about seeing a man who he identified as being a very macho man being willing to engage in this activity that then somehow gave him permission to be willing to try it without it threatening his masculinity. Right? And so the solution here is something like this: to be more inclusive, right? To broaden our definition of manhood, right? So the idea is, again, if something is socially constructed, it has the ability to be shifted and changed. This is one of the primary benefits of theorizing sex, gender, and sexuality under a social constructivist lens, if not, a more critical lens, because the earlier views do not allow for this sort of change. And so here he goes on to talk about how masculinity is this homosocial enactment, right? And so what that means is that, again, we are enacting a certain way of, in this case, engaging in social interactions that demonstrate homophobia.